So this has been quite an extraordinary day. And of course, this conference couldn't close properly without giving Bob and Myron the last words. So we're going to do that in just a few minutes. But before we do that, I wanted to make a few closing remarks, both thanks and also to highlight some of the connections that were made over the course of the day with a number of the different speakers. So the first thing I want to do is give some words of thanks. First of all, I want to thank all of you for spending the day with us. And for those of you who were here last night and will stay through tomorrow, thanks even more. And as a small token of our thanks, you will all get this handsome tote bag that's outside. So make sure you get it before you leave. And in the tote bag are a number of goodies, but probably the most interesting one is Fisher Black's 50 Questions. It is here. And thanks to Roy Hendrickson, who actually got a copy of it. We reproduced it, so all of you can have a copy of it. And if any of you can answer these questions, please submit them to us, and you may get a PhD in finance. I also want to thank the people that are listed here. The organizing committee that I mentioned earlier. Also, the staff has been incredible. And in particular, I want to shout out to people that are in the room right now, Jana Cummings and Kate Lyons. Please give them a hand. Jana, thank you. And I also want to thank SIBO for reasons that you already know, but for a couple of reasons that you don't yet know. So in particular, Paul Anderson has been terrific in working with us and making this sponsorship possible. And let me explain a little bit about the sponsorship. So we actually didn't need any financial sponsorship. The dean said that he'd be happy to underwrite this event. And of course, we were going to do the celebration here. But we wanted to get SIBO involved for the very specific reason that it is their 50th anniversary. And there's a very deep connection between SIBO and Black Scholes Merton, as you know. But there are stories within stories. And the more I learn, and every year I talk to Bob and Myron, I learn more about these connections. I really think a movie should be made about the origins of the Black Scholes Merton formula. And I've actually figured out who the optimal actors are to play these. So Fisher Black should be played by Ethan Hawke. That's definitely the case. Bob should be played by Robert De Niro. And Myron should be George Clooney. Don't you agree? I think those are the perfect actors. But one of the things that I discovered from the story of SIBO is, well, you all know that the papers were published in 1973, and that quite coincidentally, SIBO was founded in 1973. But there's a deeper connection that's not totally coincidental, maybe more serendipitous. And that is that a year before SIBO was founded, Bob and Myron happened to go down to New York and present their work before the options formula was published, present their work to, is it David Pomerantz? Leo Pomerantz at Donaldson, Lufkin, and Jenrette. And Leo Pomerantz was ultimately left DLJ to join SIBO and was part of the founding team. And so it wasn't exactly totally coincidental that the Black Scholes formula played such an important role. That was clearly an example where finance theory moved into practice quite deliberately. But there are a couple of interesting things in addition that I learned over the years being at MIT, and it has to do with not what happened in 1973, but what happened in 1975. In 75, what happened was three things at SIBO. One, computerized price reporting occurred. Second, the Options Clearing Corporation was founded. And third, the Black Scholes Merton formula was officially adopted by SIBO. And the reason it had been adopted was actually technological. It's because, as you've heard, the floor traders started using the formulas. Some of them used them from the very beginning, but it really became common usage in 1975 for two reasons. One of them was the official adoption of the formula, but the second reason was this. You've heard about the Texas Instruments calculator several times now today. It was the SR52, a programmable calculator, the first of its kind that was offered by Texas Instruments for $400, which in today's dollars is about $2,300. It's not cheap. But the thing about this calculator that made it unique was that it was programmable, meaning that you could actually write code, a sequence of keystrokes, and store it on a little magnetic wafer. And you could take that magnetic wafer and give it to your friends, like floor traders at SIBO. And so another founding member of the exchange was a floor trader named Erwin Gutag. And he had traded options even before the exchange was founded. A very enthusiastic individual who happened to have a teenage son that was into math and science and happened to get a calculator, and he asked his son if he could program the formula. And that was the beginning of how the floor traders started using the formula, because they passed around this magnetic wafer from one to the other and they started trading it. So there's a very important connection between technology, practice, and theory. And that teenager went on to study STEM and ultimately arrived at MIT as an assistant professor, and ultimately became the chair of the computer science and electrical engineering computer science department, John Gutag. And actually, John is here today, sitting in the back. He's been here all day. So, John, thank you. Thank you for playing the part. Thank you.
I was instead a PhD student, and it's sad to say, no program I have written since I was a student has been as good as the one I did.
Now, so this highlights the importance of Texas Instruments and the calculator and the formula. And so you understand now why when Myron was speaking to the folks at Texas Instruments, that he would expect that they might at least say a word of thanks, give them some royalties, whatever. And that wasn't to be. So Myron, on the occasion of the 50th, we decided to contact Texas Instruments on your behalf and ask again. And I guess you won't be surprised to hear that they still won't give you any royalties. But what they did do is they actually provided letters to congratulate you and Bob on this 50th occasion. The Dr. Belita, who is the head of the educational division at Texas Instruments, wrote, "Dear Mr. Merton, dear Mr. Scholes, congratulations on this milestone for mathematics, 50 years of the Black-Scholes-Merton option pricing formula. Your powerful ideas has been a transformative innovation for the financial industry. We hope you enjoy this new TI-84 Plus calculator." And so, in fact, they have now given both you and Bob these are the letters signed by the Texas Instruments head. Bob, for you, Myron. And we actually didn't expect them to give us the calculators. We bought 2 calculators to give to Bob. So these are the ones that we bought, and we're going to give one to John, of course, and Alethea. So let's see, John, here you go. Alethea.
I didn't know the story until today that Myron, when this calculator came out and it said calculates Black-Scholes, had reached out and said, "Hey, that's intellectual that's our brand." And at the time, I don't know if you remember, Melissa, our mother said the same thing. Dad never said anything, but our mom was like, "Wait a minute. That's your name. You should get something for that." So this whole thing has added meaning, double added meaning today.
Well, so we just learned from Carlos Baldwin that making certain kinds of technologies modular and giving an open system might actually improve the overall ecosystem. And I think this is an example that Fisher, Myron, and Bob, they contributed to the ecosystem, and all of us are better for it. So thank you, Bob, Myron, and Fisher and Lethea family. With that, let me turn it over to Bob and Myron for their words.
Part of that is I've had a little surgery and I've been sitting too long. So if you don't mind, I'll stand for a while. Okay? I don't need a seat. That's okay. Well, Myron, if you know, this goes back forever, but if Myron started talking, I know I'd never get a chance. And you, who are my students, know I'm a talker, so that's quite a statement. Anyway, so I just want to first of all say this was a great event. I want to thank the organizers. I want to ask the participants who took part in it, papers and so forth. And I mean a really great event in the sense that I didn't have to do a thing, and it was a great treat. And what was put together, from my perspective, was as good as it could possibly wish for, not expect. And that is that it exemplified in so many ways the spirit of what's happened. And so that's where I really wanted to start. But I have a couple of things I'm going to take some time to talk about. And the main thing, which I'll come to in a minute, I'm afraid won't remember all those detailed ones that were said, which is this is the 50th anniversary and we're celebrating it. Now, leave aside longevity. If you've studied science, the history of science or sociology of science, it's very rare that you have a major, contribution to the science where it's still being used. Not that it's not remembered and said this was a milestone and very, very important, but it's not being used, just like, people don't use lots of things technologically that were very important. And it's still being used. So I was trying to give thoughts, why? Is this just an accident or something? So I wanted to talk about that. But, I had a couple of specific notes to mention on getting royalties that you just mentioned. I hadn't planned on this. I can report firsthand from Fisher, I tell his family, that he believed, or he told me he believed, so of course he believed, that we made more economic value by putting the formula in the public domain than we would have ever made had we been able to patent it. We never thought of patenting it. In fact, at that time, I'm not sure even legally you could patent such things. But this is a report, not a judgment, that he thought we actually did personally, financially better by putting it in the public domain. But, we're here at MIT, we're academics. That's what we do in academia. Our job is to put knowledge out there for the world to have, not to keep it from a secret or charge people to look at it. So I just picked up on your comment about that I wanted to make it. The second thing I wanted to mention, and this related to the panel on talking about government and so forth, and I can only put a small footnote, but because Peter Hancock is here, and he's been on panels and so forth, it's particularly apropos. I don't know if you know, but AIG, before Peter became in charge, so he wasn't responsible, got, I think, $180 billion from the government. Is that correct, Peter? So I could just think about it. Just stop for a second. $180 billion to one company. Okay? And I can also report to you, years later, when they were still trying to work out AIG, that the CBO, you heard Debbie give it the stamp of it's a serious organization, estimated that it was going to cost the taxpayers' neck about $60 billion, meaning they estimated you might recover 120 of the 180. The biggest issue at that time was whether AIG was going to be liquidated, essentially eliminated from the earth as an organization, or recapitalized as a going concern. It clearly couldn't be capitalized if it wasn't recapitalized, because nobody's going to put money into a firm where the Fed and everybody else is waiting to take the money to pay the loans, okay? So that was a huge issue, and you can imagine, and if you don't remember it from 2008, it was also a very emotional one. Many people wanted it to be liquidated, having nothing to do with economics. They just wanted it to be, and remember, this was the largest insurance company in the world, I believe. If it wasn't the largest, it was close to it, okay? Now, why do I bring this up? I bring this up because it ended up getting capitalized, but it was not clear that that was going to happen because there was a huge conflict of interest within the government. The Fed, as the most senior creditor, was going to get paid no matter what, even if they liquidated it. The Treasury, which held essentially preferred stock, if it was liquidated, was very unlikely to get anything. So even though we thought the government was in control, it was not a monolith. We had a coordination problem. You know, it's a classic problem. And where does that relate to today? Peter, who would be the first to admit that his formal education was a very good university, Oxford, but not exactly, you know, PhD in finance, but who had contributed, understood finance and figured out a way to solve the problem of how could you get it recapitalized? How could you bring them together? To do that, he had to show there was enough value in the recapitalization to make it work, to take the risk. Well, why should they take the risk? Okay? How did he do it? He used exactly what was being talked about today, all the technology that we've been talking about all day long. He pointed out to them that the only people in the world who knew enough to put a serious value on AIG were the employees. Nobody else. You couldn't bring McKinsey in or something. I mean, it was mind-boggling. But of course, the employees were not exactly unbiased, or they might be thought they're not. So how do you solve that? He said, let the market do it. He said, you know, the market's not infallible, but it's pretty serious, and people are putting up real money, and frankly, I don't think they're biased one way or another, which one they do. So how do you let the market answer that question? And the question is the difference in value between going concern and liquidation. So it wasn't just look at the market prices of the traded assets, and how do you do that? Well, without belaboring the whole story, there's a wonderful case here at MIT, which I'm proud to say was done at MIT and not the place that do lots of cases up the river, who wanted to do it. But what it was about was to say, okay, how do we get that extraction? And they used exactly the sorts of thing that we, remember, Steve, and you were talking about the Q distributions and all this, and they did every one of the implies they did. They wanted to extract information. They used every instrument issued by AIG, both traded options, but also all the capital structure, using that kind of thing. And to shorten the story up, after going through all that, they were able to extract an implied distribution, which happily was bimodal. And Peter's here to correct any of the story. So if he doesn't, either he likes the embellishment or you notice it's an accurate depiction. And he was able then, from those that picture the bimodal, and you don't usually see that kind of distribution for stock values, okay? He said, it's no question why there's two humps. The most important thing to the value of AIG at that time was whether they were going to be recapitalized or not. So he was able to use that distance corrected for risk, blah, 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 to quantify an unbiased, serious estimate of the value of recapitalization. And the number was substantially large enough to convince the Federal Reserve, who by requirement isn't supposed to take any risk, okay, to allow, to make it possible to then recapitalize the company, and then they did all of that. So I ask you as a group, how likely it is that an insurance company executive or a financial executive brought in to make IG, to try to work on AIG, who had no PhD, okay, in finance or anything else, okay, would know enough and have the confidence to be able to say, let's bring in the science to all this work you saw presented today to make, was probably the most public, thing about the crisis, okay? And it worked. And then I'll just finish the story, so maybe you can go, we've heard some ups and downs today. We heard about government. But the bottom line was, in the end, the U.S. government actually made a profit. Now, we all know ex post, there's lots of risks, but so that experiment, that thing that allowed that to happen, ended up creating $86 billion in value for the taxpayers. So I'm sorry to take such time on a detail, but I couldn't resist as I listened to each talk about capital structure, about implied volatility. There could be no better example of that in terms of implying it in this public sector for society. So too long on that, but I just couldn't resist thinking that. All right, the next thing I wanted to say is, why 50 years later? The first reason I give is that options are actually as structurally very, very important. Imagine when you make decisions under uncertainty. First of all, if you use models where there's no uncertainty, options have no use. Insurance has no use, right? Because if you know the future, flexibility that you've heard all day has no use because we know the future. So as with most of finance, it's all about risk. That's what finance people do. Finance people, like less so than other economists, never ask seriously, what do you expect to happen? They ask, what can happen? And that means the focus is on risk. Okay, so when we make decisions all the time, every time, if somebody offers you free assurance, Debbie says maybe underpriced insurance, if you could get it for free, how many people wouldn't take it? It's not a decision you even have to discuss. But of course, insurance is never, and most things are never free. So, I look at Stu Meyer's beautiful Bentley, and I look at it and say, wow, that's nice. And then I go and I look at what? The price, and I buy a Camry. Well, okay, but, don't spoil my story. Anyway, no, I say this because it's so basic that we forget about it sometimes. It's worth mentioning. Every decision under uncertainty ultimately involves looking at the cost, and then is it worth it for the benefit? That's what we do all the time. So being able to price options, which is flexibility, which had no value in a certainty world, but are absolutely essential in order to understand every piece of decision making. And I only mention this to say, so it's not surprising that options appear almost everywhere. We've heard that all day long, okay? And so I wanted to say that's, to me, that's it. And the other thing to just mention, those who are in the asset management or business, there are really only three ways. Some people say four, but I say three ways to manage risk. Diversification, hedging, that's replacing the risky asset with a risk-free asset, and insurance. And options are insurance. So it is a very fundamental instrument, functionally, independent of the actual institutional thing of insurance, how it's designed. All right. Second thing was timing. You know, I like to say it's always better to be lucky than smart, in the sense that you can be very smart and fail. But if you're lucky, by definition, you're always a success. Now, both would be kind of nice. But Myron, you mentioned once, make this sound personal. You mentioned that if yesterday in your lecture, that maybe if we had discovered the option model earlier than the CAPM or something, we'd be doing valuation differently. And this is related to still talking about with DCF versus options valuation. If that work had been done in published in 1973, but published in 1963, first of all, I have to say I don't think it would show up in the Journal of Political Economy. But secondly, I don't think it would have gotten much attention. It might got published, but it was highly specialized, and who cares? Okay? We got lucky in the sense that the work got done when it did. We had the coincidence of that work getting done, all the development of the finance science that had followed that. And then what else happened? We heard about 360 systems and so forth coming in from Carlos and so forth. Technology, much as we've been talking in today about technology, came in, so there was that. But the third one was need. A series of shocks hit the U.S. financial system, okay, in every way. And I'm not going to run through that whole list, but let me just mention Bretton Woods. After a generation, suddenly overnight, all those things that were fixed weren't, okay? Double-digit inflation, okay? Oil crisis where oil went from $2.40 a barrel to $13 a barrel. You think that's inflation today was bad in that? Imagine that. And of course, if you have very high rates of inflation, where were interest rates? We've heard about that. I mean, interest rates, I guess, peaked in 81 at 21% on treasuries, if you can imagine it. So go down that whole list. Stock market fell 50% in real terms. Every kind of shock. Oh, by the way, with all the inflation, what else happened? 9% unemployment. That's not supposed to happen in macro, right? You either have inflation or you have unemployment, and there's a cure for each. What happens when you have both? I only do that to remind us that we had the three elements needed for innovation and implementation of innovation. We had the science development, that got done. We had the technology to implement the science. That calculator may look pretty slim, but and third, that we had the need. And so the influx that we had on practice came from, in my view, the enormous amount of innovation, including creating an options exchange, which is to insure against those equity risks, interest rates risks, currency risks, all of that. And that was lucky from our perspective. It may be lucky from everyone's perspective. So that's timing. Okay? The third one is CBO, and this was alluded to by Andrew's comments. But at that time, you couldn't have an electronic thing on the floor. Who wants to trade with people who may be getting front-running information, right? So that was banned. Before that, options were traded by appointment, in other words, in the OTC market. You were creating a market, which you could see from the formula, required you to combine the stock market, interest rates, and option prices all at the same time to do trading, and do trading in a trading market. So how do you do that? You have three eyeballs that looks at those three markets when you have no connection. You're not even allowed to do it. The answer is that what the Black-Scholes formula gave was not only a pricing of it, that was important, but it gave the delta. It gave the risk, the relative risk. And that delta, which is in that, I assume it's in this one, but it was in the old Texas Instruments, was what the traders actually really used, the floor people, because that told them they didn't want to take just open position. They didn't want to just buy an option. It's too much risk. They wanted to hedge it. They're market, they're floor traders. They only want to take the risk they knew about. So by having the deltas, they could immediately know what ratio of which option to buy and which one to sell short to hedge the risk that they didn't want to take on the floor by themselves with no electric connection. Finally, the formula made sense. The basis. And it didn't depend on knowing the mean, the expected return, which everybody found bizarre. How could you think that the call option should have the same price independently of what you think the mean is, if you're bullish or bearish, okay? But that eliminated the first moment, which everybody knows you can't estimate with any degree of precision. And if you were even doing under heroic statistical things, you might take 40 years of data at assumption of so forth, whatever the number is, okay? And so it became very practical because standard deviation, on the other hand, could be estimated much more accurately for the data. So we know who was right and wrong afterwards. Whereas with the mean, even after the fact, you don't know if the bear or bull, had it right, okay? So I wanted to point all this out to you to say that was, in my view, what drove it being used. It had every aspect to it that solved a real world situation, including the issues that I raised with you. So, that's it. Now, I'll be done soon, but financial engineering. Okay, we heard that mentioned something. Frankly, the science of finance really began with Harry Markowitz and developed a great deal by the end of the 60s. But I could tell you firsthand, it was not having a great deal of impact on practice. Even if the firms that hired quants, like their Picasso, they would put them in a room, and any client came along, they'd open the door and say, "There are your quants, quickly close it," in fact, so much so that the Q group was created because they felt a little bit like they had been, sort of enemy, they had just sort of been left out. And maybe it's coincidental, but I believe all the engineering that had to get done to solving the creating of new markets. And this particular development, I believe, is what really drove financial engineering. And I wanted to say a little more about it. First, I should say to you, and those who took my class will remember, essentially from the beginning, not the way it's written in the academic papers, but the way I taught it, I always taught the pricing model as a production theory, not as a pricing model, okay? And if you think about how it works, so you've heard it alluded to, replication, dynamic replication, no arbitrage means that you have a dynamic strategy that exactly replicates the payoffs. And then if you go to the difference of them, you have no risk. So replication, if you think about it, it's a production process. If there were no options on the planet and people wanted the payoffs to that insurance type instrument, you can manufacture it. Why? You take the Black-Scholes formula, that's your production cost, not the price, the production cost, to the lowest cost producers. Because remember, you only get replication, even in theory, if you can do frictionless transactions continuously. Okay? So even though people sometimes say options are redundant because you can replicate them, only the lowest cost producers can do that. And it's just like me saying, what would it cost me to make a Sony television set? Zillions of dollars, and it probably wouldn't work. That's irrelevant, as we know. What we're interested in is the lowest cost producers. So I always taught that price as a production cost. And the trading strategy, the deltas, the things that came out of what Myron and Fisher said, their concept that you had to do things dynamically, okay? The delta is essentially the assembly line production. It's the production. It tells you what to do. If this happens, change the position to this. If you do it all right, make no mistakes, you'll exactly produce this thing without adding any cash to it. That's a production process and a production function. And in that sense, I wanted to just on this occasion say that's pretty fundamental. And it's also the reason I think it's still being used conceptually 50 years later, because it's a production theory. It's a way of thinking about it. You say, not what it'll sell for in the market, in a competitive market, it might sell at marginal cost, but in an oligopoly or in a monopoly, it could sell at any price. Okay? So I think that's one element I wanted to mention. The second thing is that it's a normative model. It doesn't depend on everybody else being rational. It doesn't depend on a particular equilibrium model or everybody has to believe in, mean variance or something. It just says to you, what's the cost of producing this? Well, if you believe the model, you put in your numbers, you get a price. And then you get the way to manufacture it to actually hedge it, to produce it. Okay? And if you're good at estimating those numbers, like any other competitive, production process, you're going to be the winner. And if you're not good at estimating those numbers, or if you're poor at execution, you're not. So I just wanted to remind everybody on this occasion, this is very basic and fundamental, and that's why I think it's there. And it also fits because I don't have to depend on anyone else. Okay? There doesn't have to be an arbitrage. It's just simply a production process. And finally, on this, I believe it created an enormous amount of confidence. And I'm looking at people in this room, some of who've been doing it for decades, and is when you go to solve a problem, go to a client or someone that has a problem, instead of going and saying, well, I got this product, let me fit you into this product. This is a product you need to solve your problem. For someone who has hammers, all solutions are, all problems are nails, and same with saws. What happens here is, once you realized, and this came up, that it isn't special to options, the approach. Any contractual agreement that depends on underlying asset prices or security, and certainly ones that can be traded, the same methodology, the same rigor, the same set of assumptions, okay, will allow you to price it. You mentioned in a couple of the comments today about debt, about corporate debt. Well, even if you didn't see that to begin with in structure, you'd see it from the equations. Why? Because the only difference between a put and a call in the equations is the boundary condition. And so all you have to do is, if it's debt, you put in the boundary condition for that. If it's a squiggle that you've never seen before, you put that, whatever a squiggle is, you put it in, and everything works. So obviously, it's a very general valuation formula for anything. And that's why the Nobel Committee, I believe, did not say the prize for developing an option model. It was for a new methodology to price derivatives, which by that time had become a term to mean any contractual agreements. And that in itself led to other things that were talked about today, which is, Arrow Securities, the et cetera. It reconciled Arrow's model of the world with state preference, which was very elegant, but of course there aren't uncountable zillions of security and no trading. That is completely different. And also the Markowitz-Tobin stuff, which was very intuitive, and everybody liked to use it, except it wasn't consistent with the expected utility theorem. So nobody taught it, at least in the school. And all of that got reconciled with this work. So the science got benefit, practice got benefit, and engineering, you now said, I can go see a client with a confidence, I don't even know what they need. I can listen to their problem, figure out what I need for a solution, and then write that contract. And then you have to have the skill sets to sell it, but that's what J.P. Morgan or Goldman Sachs or others do. So I just wanted to, say that's still true today. And then there were measurements about having simpler models. We did constant vol or something. But notice what's happened. From the very beginning, we've had, and you saw many of them today, and June was mentioning them in the models as well in her talk. Okay, stochastic volatility. You build those models. How well they do or not, that's not the point. You can say that's an assumption that was in the original model. We can get rid of it. We can have that. Jump diffusions, the realization that the process may not be always continuous, which is in the original assumption. Okay? And so on and so on and so on. What has always happened, though? Despite the fact that you make all these big differences, changes, and improvements of the model, the process is exactly the same as on day one. That's why we're still celebrating it. It's set up the equation, do the replication. Here's how to do it. Whether it's a PDE or whatever, it has a more complicated set of coefficients. It has more state variables. I sometimes think we kept Mr. Moore's Intel and the whole industry going because every time they thought there'd be excess computing capacity, all we do is add one more variable to the derivatives model, and right away you're up against the computational barrier. So, but the point being, I really will quit on this, but I wanted you to say thank you again, because if you think about what everybody presented today, and I assume while there was communication, that it wasn't coordination, it wasn't built around, something I wrote saying, this is the way I look at the world, and they said, let's create a set of talks that replicate that. In fact, I feel very good about it because on their own, they brought together what was, exactly what I think is it. So I could add nothing more to it. I appreciate at this end of this long day, you putting up with this, but I've tried to be quiet all day long. This is called in the bank type, and so with that, Myron, I yield the floor.
My remarks are ditto. I want to, and I'm going to be very brief because I did talk sometime during the day, but I knew Bob was going to take the floor and take the half hour, so that's good. I didn't have to prepare much, but I'd like to thank the committee and Andy and others here at MIT for putting on this anniversary and the 50th anniversary. And my heart and mind really were at MIT with my colleagues that I came to and here in 1968 and have the fortunate thing to meet Fisher Black in the fall of 1968. And then the fortunate thing to have gone to Wells Fargo Bank during the summer of 1968 before coming here to MIT and doing my first consulting project and describing to them why their use of the Markowitz model was fraught with problems because they had, even though their financial management science department had built the optimization of using Markowitz, that basically they had no inputs to it and there was no clients that Wells Fargo had. So it's like building this magnificent cookie making machine and having no dough to put in the cookie machine and no one to eat the cookies coming out of the machine. So at the time, I suggested to them that maybe they should think about an alternative, which is passive strategies or doing passive investment. And I thought that would be a new innovation, having learned from the work of Michael Jensen that basically mutual funds didn't seem to outperform anyone at the time, and that was using data for the first time. But the point is I'm raising this now is because I had the fortunate to have lunch with Fisher Black in the first fall that I was at MIT. And among all the colleagues that we had at MIT, which were many, and it was a great environment to be in, and I stole everything I could from everyone around me at the time and really enjoyed all the interactions. But Michael Jensen said I should have lunch with Fisher Black, and So Fisher Black was at RFD Little at the time, and he invited me to the dining room, and we talked, and he had ideas and I had ideas, so it was pretty copacetic. So in our ideas, and when it was the case that Wells Fargo said to me that they would then gave me a call and said, we'd like to do some research and thinking on this idea of passive investments. Could you do the research and get involved in research? And I said, well, it'd be nice if I can include Fisher Black, who told me that at the time he was thinking of leaving RFD Little and setting up his own firm. And so I said he can be the person who was doing the consulting in the sense of going across the country, flying while I was at MIT teaching my classes and being trapped into doing that on a consistent basis and the like. And he agreed. And so we started a project together with Wells Fargo on setting up passive strategies, or what later became index funds. And it took a long time. Innovation leads infrastructure, leads development, but it took a long time for that to come fruition. But somehow they supported it for a long time. And from that, led to, and not with us, but led to the development of more passive strategies, index funds by 1974. So the early bird gets the worm. But as Bob's father said, the counter adage is the early bird sometimes gets frozen to death, and we were almost frozen. But when I bring that up is because that interaction, that consulting throughout the practice, we did empirical work together, and that Wells Fargo was willing to support research, and they were supporting everything. And part of our thinking, where we started working on options together, was since buying a passive investment didn't seem sexy at all. Anyone can do it. Just buy a diversified portfolio and hold it. Basically, they wanted to get a lot of research to know, was that feasible? Could you do that? Two was, can you jazz it up? Can you make it into something that was more exciting? So one of the things Fisher and I started talking about to make it jazz it up was the idea, can we use options, to get the risk level changes and things like that? And we started working together on options, in part because of that particular scenario and that. But I'd like to really thank MIT and the heritage here of supporting this research and supporting us, and then involving Fisher to come to MIT and be involved in Franco's Tuesday nights, I think it was Tuesday night seminars, where we had lots of cross-fertilization of ideas and discussion with quite a disparate group of scholars that were very interested in that. And, I was like a kid in a candy store in the sense of being here at MIT and what I learned through the collegial interchanges and being fortunate enough to meet great colleagues, and then having Bob Merton join us a year later and coming into my office and, what is this 412? What is this course? What did we teach basic finance? So I gave him some basic things that I had taught, and he obviously took that to heart, and he really built a wonderful sequence of courses and research in that area. So it was the idea of things that are here. I just want to say that I think that at the time that data became so important, the development of data, so we can build testing of various of these theories. And there was very little data to test anything on portfolio theory. There's very little data to test anything about the basic things in finance. And one of the things why I think that the investment side caught on so wonderfully over time was we had more data. When it came to capital structure issues or corporate finance type issues, there wasn't that plethora of data that we had developed to be able to test that. So that became more difficult because the combination of testing theory and how it applies was very important to how we develop things. And I think when the Chicago Board Options Exchange was formed, and I thank the Chicago Board for support for this conference as well, was the data started to come available, and then you could start testing things, and people could see how the combination of the theory and the data, and then enhancing the ability to have intuition to do things, was so valuable. And so I think this plethora of data that we have developed over time and is something that we're going to see now through maybe AI and the development. We're going to get large amounts of new data available in the real markets or the other markets that we can have in addition to just the financial markets. So corporate data will be available. Someone somewhere I read, I don't know if it's true, that only 5% of the data that's produced by a corporation is actually saved. You know, in fact, what we have is the world of finance has been transaction processing. You know, the idea of trying to clear a transaction. That's what most of it was, recording transaction, clearing transaction. Very little is the idea of thinking about storing time series of data and now cross-sectional data to be able to do transaction analyzing, not just transaction processing, but transaction analyzing. As soon as you start doing transaction analyzing, all our theories come to richness in life, and we can create many new things because we can learn from the results we're having how to adjust our theory or to add to it and get rid of constraints that we have had in terms of the development of theory. So I think that the idea of transaction analyzing, which is time series, and then with the optionality, which I love, is the idea we can have not only time series, and that's what a lot of we do in finance, as I said, is look backwards to find out how to analyze things, that we can also include cross-sectional information, richness in cross-sectional information, and the option theory and markets give us that cross-section with which to deal with. Just 2 points, and I will let us go for drinks, and is that there's a lot of myriad stories in the development at the time that Chicago Board of Exchange developed and what we did, but one in particular is that they asked me to give a talk to their traders on the floor of the exchange about options and what the difference between puts and calls were. At the time, they were going to introduce puts. And so about 700 traders came to this talk, and they had and I gave the talk, and I explained the difference between a put and a call in the sense of the exercise problems that you have in a put that weren't necessarily there in a call. And about 4 or 5 months later, I came back from giving a talk, and a taxi driver picked me up at O'Hare Field and was taking me back to Hyde Park, where I lived at the time. And I noticed on his front seat of the car was the book called Capitalism and Freedom, which is written by Milton Friedman. I said, "Oh, that's interesting. You're reading the book." And he says, "Yeah, I'm reading the book." And he says, I said, "How do you know that?" And I said, "Well," he said he knew 2 professors at Chicago. And I said, "Oh, you know Milton Friedman, who's the other one?" I said, "But it's Professor Scholes." And I said, "Well, you know, how do you know Professor Scholes?" And he says, "Well, I heard him give this talk on the floor of the Board of Trade to us traders, describing the difference between puts and calls." I said, I'm cowering a little bit, you know, and he's driving the taxi. He says, "Well, you know, I started trade puts and that, and I traded them, and then I lost money in trading the puts, and, you know, and I started drink, you know, and I lost my girlfriend." And he said, "Then I got in a car accident, I broke my leg, you know, so I'm now driving a taxi to rehabilitate myself, you know." So we got up to my house, and I was going to get out of the car, and I said, "Well, what was it that you had this Professor Scholes did?" And what he said, he said, "Well, you know, so if I only had listened to him and his theory about the difference between puts and calls, I wouldn't have lost all this money." And so I said, I got out of the car after paying my fare, and I said, "Hi, by the way, I'm Professor Scholes." So, but the interesting thing is that you do have a tremendous impact on people and how they tend to do things, but it's a combination of theory and the like. But, you know, I miss Fisher. I enjoyed my many conversations with him and my interactions with him, and learned a tremendous amount from him. And, you know, and everything that was said about him and his family all is really true. But I think that he had a great desire to keep learning and to keep growing and to keep interacting. And so we have had that great pleasure today to do such. And I really appreciate this. And there was no way when Andy called me and said, "Would you come?" I said there was no way I would say no, because not only do I appreciate it, but for me, it's an honor to come here and do this. And in this building, I guess on the second floor, was where we had all these conversations and great learning that we had all together. So I really appreciate that, and we'll continue to do it. And hopefully we can have more of these ceremonies sometime in the future. So thank you very much.